But you know, having the benefit of a little bit of perspective and time since November 4th, it's also important to look at just how far we've come, and that there's no way, despite a loss in Florida, a loss in Arkansas, a loss in Arizona, and a loss in California, that we are nowhere near being back at square one. In just the 13 years since my son was born, the year he was born, there were still at least a dozen states in this country where just being an openly lesbian or gay parent lost you custody of your kids. There were hardly any states that allowed openly lesbian, gay, bisexual, or transgender parents to adopt. There were only a handful of companies that provided employment benefits. There were no positive representations of LGBT life in our popular culture. And just this afternoon, as I'm at Lori Masters' house, come out of the shower again. This is not something I'm doing all the time, but I just come out of the shower again. And Oprah is on, and Oprah's show is talking about sexual fluidity. And how is it that people come out later in life, and how the community and the culture should support them. And Oprah is using the exact talking points that 2 weeks ago I was giving her producers when they called us for background about how they should talk about this issue and what they should say. And I'm thinking, okay, I'm not in Kansas anymore, I'm in Texas, and Oprah is talking about this issue. We have come so far in the blink of an eye relative to every other struggle. And what we have to understand is that even though I would do anything to go back and have things be different around the outcome of Prop 8, there is so much to learn about how far we've come. And even in a place like Utah, even in a place like Texas, there is so much that is being done here. The work that Lambda Legal is doing, extraordinary, groundbreaking. We are partnering with them on a number of initiatives and cases. Today, we just issued, hot off the presses, a family protection manual for legal aid attorneys in Texas who represent poor LGBT folks. It was legal aid attorneys who wanted this kind of a resource. We worked with them, and now, today, just published today, they've got it to be able to do the work that they need to do to be proactive advocates for LGBT clients that they serve in Texas. We have adoption and foster care cases that we're doing here, DP benefits work with UT. It's changing everywhere in this country. And what we have to recognize, and what I've come to recognize, is that there's a reason why it's called a civil rights struggle. There's something important about that word, struggle. It's not a civil rights play date or a civil rights tea dance. It is a civil rights struggle. And that means it's going to be hard. And there are going to be moments of soaring joy, and there are going to be moments of utter dismay. And what separates the men from the boys, and I mean everybody in that, you know what I mean, what separates those who are willing to move forward and say we're all in from those who give up that's what tells the difference between whether we will hit the finish line and how soon we will hit that moment. Now, as Dennis pointed out, I grew up in Utah. Grew up there, lived my whole life there, went to school there, came out there. My former partner and I raised a daughter there. I've seen the worst of homophobia. And I grew up in a Mormon household. My mother was a devout Mormon up until the day she died. And yet when I came out to her at 19, scared to death in a moving vehicle, I don't know why I did it. I guess I just felt like if I'm in a car, I don't have to look at her. But then it didn't occur to me, well, if she wants to look at me, then we're in trouble because she's supposed to be looking at the road. But when I came out to her, scared to death about what her reaction might be, she turned to me, just for a couple of seconds, but turned to me and said, honey, it's okay. All I care about is that you're happy. And she never wavered from that sentiment. In 1993, my mother had a devastating stroke, and 10 years later, she had another stroke. By this time, 10 years later, I was living in San Francisco, and my sister called me and said, you've got to get out here right away. Mom's in the hospital, she's just had another stroke, we're not sure if she's going to make it. So of course I was on the very next plane back to Utah. I wasn't sure if I was going to make it in time. I did make it, and watched my mother once again begin this hard climb back to being able to be somewhat self-sufficient, and to now even being able to communicate. Because what the first stroke didn't take around her communication skills, the second stroke did. So I'm there a month after the second stroke, and she's still in the hospital. The speech therapist comes to take her for speech therapy. My mother is still having a very hard time communicating very simple things even. But the speech therapist comes, and I have to say, the speech therapist, either a dyke or a Mormon housewife, it was impossible to tell. You know, there's something about these Midwest states, you just can't tell. She took my mom to her speech therapy, and she's asking her what would normally be very simple questions. Afton, my mother's name Afton. Afton, how many children do you have? What do your children do for a living? These are all very difficult questions for my mother to come up with this information. Where do your children live? Again, very difficult. She sort of struggles through, she gets it right, sort of a little bit, but not exactly right. Well, the speech therapist turns to me and she says, well, Kathy's here. My family calls me Kathy. Kathy's here from San Francisco, as you just told us, although she didn't quite get that exactly right, but the speech therapist was able to figure it out. From San Francisco, why don't you tell us what Kathy does for a living? I thought, oh, this is going to be fascinating. And my mother looked at me and she looked at the speech therapist and she said, oh, what Kathy does is very important. She takes care of all the lesbians and gays in the world. The speech therapist looks at me and says, oh, that's an awfully big job. Dyke. And in that moment, hearing my mother say that, I thought, wow, here is my mother who holds these two core identities, a devout Mormon woman who loves her faith, and a mother who without condition loves her lesbian daughter. And if she can hold both of those identities, then anything is possible. And we have to know that. And we have to believe it. And we have to feel it. And what it requires is a conversation. To never give up, to never doubt, to take risks every single day for what that conversation might bring with someone who we think, or might suppose or assume, is unreachable. I don't know when we're going to hit the end of this struggle, whatever the end might be. But I think we all know how that final chapter is going to be written. We all know that. And we just have the hope, we just have to have the hope and the courage to every day take a risk to make that end happen sooner rather than later. Thank you so much for having me.